Our next presenter, Dr. Ariel Plotek, is Associate Curator for Modern Art at the San Diego Museum of Art and former teacher of art history at University of Southern California. His work with contemporary artists provides particular insight into those that defy traditional categories of media, including Joel Shapiro, Larry Bell, and Ron Nagel. His paper today focuses on one of the most exciting moments in American cultural history, the cross-disciplinary group of artists, choreographers, and composers, Suite for Four, Merce Cunningham, John Cage, Robert Rauschenberg, and Jasper Johns. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ariel Plotek.
I feel that this presentation of mine comes at a good time. Some of the themes that I want to develop have been addressed already. Marika was speaking just now about the idea of abstraction, sometimes in art that we don't necessarily immediately think of as abstract. Likewise, the notions of absolute music, in contrast, I should say music for music's sake, in contrast to more programmatic music. And I think that the Ragamala tradition was a fine example of that, are also themes that I want to examine. Now, I've chosen this group of artists who are well represented in our exhibition. You see above, John Cage is kind of the elder statesman of this group, with Merce Cunningham, and then down below, that's Robert Rauschenberg on the left, and Jasper Johns. We're fortunate to have a quite remarkable selection of work in the exhibition that comes, in fact, from the collection of Jasper Johns. And it was Johns' painting, Dancers on a Plane, that really inspired me to want to consider these figures. When it came time to give this talk, I'm an art historian, and I'm perhaps drawn to those works of art that are the biggest puzzles, and I think there's no one more puzzling and riddling and sometimes hermetic in his very personal iconography than Jasper Johns. The one sort of conspicuous absence here is the figure of Marcel Duchamp, so influential for all four of these men, who perhaps should have been included in our exhibition as well. And so I'm very glad that he was that his role was discussed already today. When I considered Dancers on the Plane, I thought of this performance that I witnessed in this very auditorium. I guess 4 years ago. The local dance company, Malaschock Dance, presented a work that they called The Floating World. It was inspired by an exhibition that we presented here in our galleries and that also was at the University of San Diego, of Japanese woodblock prints, ukiyo-e prints, and the performance was meant to evoke the international travel of the company and the sort of peripatetic life of the artist. And so you can see, perhaps, or imagine that these chairs were meant to, they represented the sort of the seats in an aisle on an airplane as the restless dancers begin to move. And I thought that it led us rather well to this quite iconic image of Cunningham dancing his Antic meet. This is in 1956. And when it comes to of the many sort of radical innovations that Merce Cunningham brought to the field of modern dance, none is as important probably as the separation of the performance from the accompanying music that was sort of affected in its most radical cases when Cunningham and his life partner and frequent collaborator, John Cage, would work entirely independently. That's to say that there was music composed that would not be heard by the dancers until sometimes a rehearsal, but very often the first performance of a piece, when all that was planned by the choreographer was to have the length of the two pieces coincide. They would begin and end together. What happened in between was very much left to chance. So invariably unexpected and surprising coincidences would occur during the course of the performance. I like this image here of the two, of Cunningham and Cage here holding the clock. And of course, it's bound to make us think of Cage's most famous, I suppose we could call it a composition, his 4 minutes and 33 seconds. There he is later in life. I imagine him perhaps seated at the piano, performing that, if you will, sitting in silence. And Cage said famously that it was the white paintings by Robert Rauschenberg that he had seen at the Black Mountain College where they met that gave Cage the courage to present this, what you might call a kind of neo-Dadaist performance, to seat himself at the piano and leave it to the sounds of the auditorium. Of course, what one gets when one sits in a room full of people is not true silence, but rather this accidental, the sort of chance sounds that that really become the piece's subject. And it should be said of the paintings by Robert Rauschenberg here, pictured on the right, that they were actually conceived as the backdrop to dance performances. So these earliest series of monochromatic works, whether the white paintings here or the black, blue, and red ones that followed, were they were on these assembled boards, stood about 6 feet tall. The idea was always to have the work correspond more or less to the scale, to a human scale. And indeed, they would serve as a backdrop with performers dancing in front of them. And again, there was it fell to the accidental projection of shadows, these kinds of these unforeseen effects to enliven and essentially create the work for which Rauschenberg had presented a sort of a palette, a field. Now, I wanted to also introduce these artists in the context of the exhibition and place them really sort of in what is not so much a chronological context, but rather the thematic one that was developed by myself and my colleagues in curating the show. They fall within the last of the 3 sections of the exhibition, one devoted to forms, and in particular, the relationship between musical forms and painterly ones, with a sort of an emphasis on the theme of, or the phenomenon, you might say, of synesthesia. And the group begins with this video. There's a video display in the exhibition of Merce Cunningham's company performing at a rather later date. The video we have is of 2007, a piece. This is the Suite for 5 that was composed or first performed in 1956. Here you see a performance in London of about a decade later, and the inclusion of Cunningham is not the first sort of element, let's say, of choreography that you'll find in the exhibition. We're led to to Cunningham's work first through the pairing of the moving image and music in the work of the quite radical and I think an exceptional inventor, animator, Oskar Fischinger, whose film Study Number 7 of 1931 is one of those projected in a space that is dedicated to the artist towards the end of the exhibition, and so that this relationship between the musical score and the moving image, in Fischinger's case, animated, that Cunningham would sort of rend asunder in his experiments with John Cage, is being developed here in the 30s by someone like Fischinger. Now we move, we leap into the 21st century in the video piece that is projected opposite Fischinger's in the exhibition with the work of this British-born, now New York-based artist, in particular video artist, Matthew Ritchie, whose Monstrance of 2011 is screened in the exhibition and accompanied by a score composed by Bryce Dessner of the New York band The National. And so that the choreography, which is so integral to the video, is actually sort of presented in visual form and giving us a kind of glimpse into the artist's process with a selection of 4 drawings that are hung outside of the video projection space, and that together give us a glimpse into the sort of quite idiosyncratic and magical, I would say, almost mystical sort of universe that Ritchie is creating in this video Monstroce with its sort of choreographed sequence that is repeated as the chorus of the score is repeated throughout. Now, I have here, this is a still image of a performance, the Suite for Five, that Cunningham again first performed with his company in 1956. And the point that I want to make for those who are unfamiliar with this quartet of collaborators is how intimate their relationship was, not only as friends and sort of fellow travelers in the downtown New York scene of the 50s really onwards. Jasper Johns would retire more and more to his home outside of the city, but this was the kind of New York City was the incubator that gave us these their most radical innovations. And so we have a piece here that was overseen in its original presentation by Jasper Johns as the artistic director of the company, but with costumes that were very often designed by other artists who worked closely with the group, in particular Robert Rauschenberg, but Andy Warhol, Saul DeWitt were at times invited to work with the Cunningham Dance Company as well. I have here an image which is not included in the exhibition, but which I think is a rather interesting one for us in considering Dancers on a Plane, which we'll do next. And it's a poster that Johns prepared for the Cunningham Dance Company when they're performing at the Walker Art Center. And this, I should say, was created in 1981. And what you see here is a sort of a graphic technique that Johns had been experimenting with for about 3 years already, more in fact, by the time these images were created. He had derived, and this really comes from his experiments with printmaking, a fascination with the cross-hatching technique that was used by graphic artists to create darkness in what, to modulate what are effectively linear compositions. And the sort of all-over use of that cross-hatching pattern is something that had really invaded Jasper Johns' art by the time he prepared this poster, or indeed painted the Dancers on a Plane. And it is one of the, it's a sort of, it begins to read as a kind of vehicle for chromatic experiments, work with color, and sometimes more monochromatic, I should say, as well, that seems to be the artist's true subject. But what I want to consider in my conclusion is the possibility that what we have here is, in fact, painting that is impersonating abstraction, but that has a programmatic theme that is no less legible once one begins to acquaint oneself with the very personal and sort of autobiographical iconography of the artist than the Ragamala compositions that we were just considering. First, though, to review for some of you who have perhaps not had the opportunity yet to visit the exhibition, the work of John Cage here, whose works on paper, Global Village, of which this is one, is included in the exhibition, and it's presented alongside the Jasper Johns, the painting by Jasper Johns. This, too, I should say, is a loan from the artist in a way that made a great deal of sense to me when we were considering the installation. I should say this part of the installation was undertaken by my colleague, James Grebel, but there is a decorative quality that this work shares with with Jasper Johns' Dancers on a Plane, the sort of all-over arrangement of these repeated forms that seemed, at least in aesthetic terms, to create a very sort of strong kinship between the two. We see this also in another work of that comes, I should say, from a piece created, in a sense, assembled by John Cage, and that is this volume, this work that is bound in a shattered glass case that is, I think, a very much of a direct reference and homage to Marcel Duchamp, but is in fact dedicated to the composer Eric Satie. So this is one of the elements that forms John Cage's first meeting of the Satie Society. It is in fact it's a design here by Saul LeWitt, and but again there is this sort of this all-over use of a decorative motif that seems to be very much in line with the abstract quality of Jasper Johns' Dancers on a Plane, and we'll return to Satie in a moment when we consider that painting. Let us first move on to Robert Rauschenberg's music box, also a loan from Jasper Johns, a relatively small object. We might say that it belongs to the category of the sort of junk art that sort of derived from Rauschenberg's experiments with what he called as combines, combining found objects and sort of essentially the kind of urban detritus into something new and very often amusing, very much here a direct heir to that Dadaist tradition of the absurd. He calls this, for instance, music box. What it is, in fact, is something that resembles, looks more, in fact, like some sort of tribal totem. And inside it are arranged, in this case arranged by the exhibition's curators, feathers and stones that we imagine, if shaken, would make a noise. At least the stones would. And therein lies the idea of this being a music-making instrument. But of course, it's a play here of Robert Rauschenberg's on that idea particularly of chance, of happenstance, that was as important to Marcel Duchamp as it would be to John Cage, again in his sort of as an heir to those Dadaist experiments with his own kind of fluxus work. Here is Jasper Johns, rather, with his own music box, a painting of 1955, an early work of Johns, called Tango. You can just sort of make that out in the upper left-hand corner, the inclusion of the word, which becomes so very important to Johns' practice as well, and we'll see in a moment in his Dancers on a Plane. What is more difficult to detect here in the lower right-hand corner is the key, which is used to wind a music box, which was in fact inserted by the artist, or I should say probably attached by the artist to the back of the canvas. It played Starry Night, which might be what inspired the art, what inspired Johns to select this sort of kind of celestial blue, but had been modified by the artist. The music box had a little in the manner of Cage's prepared pianos, so that it made what would actually be an unrecognizable series of plinks and sequence of sounds. So sort of very much defying our expectations at every turn, as Johns seems to delight in doing. Here is the painting that I think in some ways is one of the great stars of the modern work in the exhibition. It's a painting that hangs ordinarily at the National Gallery in D.C., which we're very fortunate to have on this occasion, lent to us by the artist. Johns, who on the one hand is reticent to reveal too much about his subjects and his themes, does nevertheless sort of tantalize every now and then with autobiographical tidbits that give us some glimmer of insight into the circumstances of the production of these works. He tells us, in this case, that there was a difficult time in his life when he painted the first Dancers on a Plane in 1979, that the kind of primary bright colors were really needed to give the artist the strength to carry on. Another feature below, this is sort of the, again, very much the sort of game we come to expect from Johns, the arrangement of the letters here that spell Merce, Cunningham, Dancers on a Plane, but have been rearranged into a sort of, into a kind of accidental jumble at the bottom of the canvas, playing with that bottom of the canvas, which in the previous work had been left unpainted altogether. And what is harder to make out on the slide here, but you can see very clearly in the gallery, is the cutlery, forks, knives, spoons, that are attached to to either side of the painting, and that frame it in some sense, that only sort of deepen the enigma of the work, and make me think, in this case, of a quote that I've heard attributed to Satie, who said once famously of his own music that he wanted it to be, his music was not to sort of to dominate or to be imposed upon the listener, but rather was to complement the sounds of forks and knives. If one imagines that as dinner music, or perhaps I think also of Richard Strauss talking about how. And this brings us back to the notion of absolute music, as opposed to the sort of more narrative, programmatic kind. That music can be made to represent anything, even a teaspoon, Strauss said. And so I wonder if that's the sort of thing that Johns had in mind when he included this detail. What scholarship has revealed to us, and what Johns confirms, is one very important source for this painting. And that is a 17th century Nepalese painting that Johns had encountered, representing the god Samvara embracing his Shakti. And you can perhaps make out the rather terrifying figure of the many-armed god, many-headed god as well, who has two of these arms at least, perhaps more, wrapped around the figure, his consort, in a rather sort of lustful embrace. In fact, the idea of kind of coitus becomes a theme that Johns develops in variations on this motif, a little like the composer working out a sort of fugue, returning time and again to the same motif. This god, associated in part with dance, becomes a sort of, we might say, a kind of a stand-in for Cunningham's dancers. And this is developed also in the second version of the Dancers on a Plane here, a painting that is in the collection of the Tate Gallery in London, and painted somewhat later, where this time it is there's a sort of more monochromatic treatment of those same hatched forms. That now that we've seen the source, the painting that was the inspiration to Johns, we can begin to discern that sort of figurative image that lives in the symmetrical, sort of mirrored cross-hatchings that form the painting. And I want to illustrate last, what Johns calls as Tantric detail, one of three that is derived from that same image, and using this cross-hatching, this time the presence of the skull and parts of the of human anatomy that sort of bring together these themes of eros and thanatos, sex and death in more explicit ways. The more that I've considered this painting and as I present it to you today, the more I begin to doubt whether or not there is what it is that we mean when we talk about abstraction in paintings, whether be it these or the American modern works of the mid-century that Marika presented to you in her presentation, whether we're not in fact dealing with a sort of a program more like programmatic music than truly sort of absolute music, music for music's sake, where the challenge is simply to decrypt, if you will, these intersecting lines, a little like the hatchings of John's paintings. So I will conclude with that question.